Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm Steve Pitty. I'm the director of the RITM Center and faculty in History, American Studies, and ERN at Yale. We're really excited to welcome our guests today, Miroslava Chávez Garcia, Luis Alvarez, and Ernesto Chávez, who, as I think everyone knows, are authors of the article entitled Navigating Successfully Grants and Fellowship Applications, that was recently published in the new edition of the Academics Handbook, just out in 2020. So let me thank Aaron Ramirez, who's here, for his work organizing the event and helping to do, first of all, to press record, that was helpful, and to get people here and to do some of the tech back work, as well as Matthew Tanico, the Associate Director of the Center, who also helped put this together. Now, I could say a lot about these three amazing guests as scholars and as people, but I'm going to keep this extremely, perhaps almost violently short. And instead, I'll just put the links to their bios in the chat so you can see more about them. I want to give us as much time to talk about the subject we're talking about as I can. So this is going to be exceedingly short, but I'll just tell you, if you don't already know, that Luis Alvarez is Associate Professor of History at the University of California at San Diego, that Ernesto or Ernie Chávez is Professor of History at the University of Texas at El Paso, and that Miroslava Chávez Garcia is Professor of History at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And all of them have additional appointments and institutional connections. They have interdisciplinary interests and accomplishments, which may come out in the course of the conversation. We have a little over an hour together, and I think the plan is for our three guests to speak for a little bit, and that then we'll have a conversation and a Q&A. Since there are so many people here on the call, I didn't want to ask everybody to introduce themselves now. That just struck me as something that would take the first 30 minutes and probably not the best use of time. But please do introduce yourself when you ask questions, so that these folks know a little bit more about who's on the call. And it may be the case that you want to say a bit about yourself as a prelude to the question that you're asking. You can also, in addition to actually vocalizing your questions, you can of course use the chat. And I'll do my best, friends, to monitor the chat and to help to kind of flag questions for Ernie, for Luis, and for Miros as we go. So I'm going to put their bios in the chat, and I'm going to turn this over to our three guests. I don't know if you all had coordinated how you want to proceed, but I think the floor is yours. Thank you.
We kind of did, right, Miros? Miros, like
You're
I
on
said,
deck.
was the boss. So
Yeah.
So I think that what we did, we had questions that were sent to us, a number of questions that were sent to us, and we divided them Miros divided them amongst ourselves. She gave them to us, basically, And so we thought that the best thing would do to address some of those questions that you had asked and give you kind of a context for things, because we thought that they were really good questions. And first of all, I want to say that, like the three of us have read applications for the Ford. I know that we all read them this year. Yes, Luis, you were in Miros and I did history. Luis did interdisciplinary this year, I think. So we've had,
that's right.
Like it's kind of fresh in our mind. And so one of the things that people were concerned with was this notion of fellowships and grants and how they're written for different stages of a project. So, with the Ford, we have the pre-dissertation, the dissertation, and the postdoc. And it's, they're three different things, right? They're three different, people are at different stages of their career. And it seems that all of you are either going to be at the pre-doc or dissertation stage at this point, right? And one of the things that was asked is how we mentioned a common framework that applicants should keep in mind when crafting the proposal, and how developed should the argument be for project descriptions at each stage of the academic career. So somebody said, in other words, can a pre-dissertation fellowship applicant be equal to a postdoctoral fellowship application? Is there such a thing as too early to apply for a fellowship? So first of all, let me just say that one of the things that we always keep in mind is this. So there are pre-doctoral fellowships, and those people that are, going to apply for that, what usually happens is they're either at the very beginning of their career. So you have, in order to get this fellowship, the Ford especially, you have to have 3 years left to complete the dissertation. So then what happens these days is that we have some people that are at the very beginning. They're undergrads and they are applying before they go to graduate school, or they're in their first year in graduate school, right? And so I think that the key is that we're always going to look at the project. And what does that mean then, right? If we compare a pre-doc project to a dissertation project, and we won't even go to the postdoc, right? I won't even talk about that. But I think that what people are looking for is that you have a sense of what you want to do. Like you're asking questions, right? So I always kind of think of any of these proposals as telling us, I have this idea for a project and I think it looks this way. And I have read the literature on that, right? I've done some research on this and I have this idea and I'm asking these questions and these are the kinds of sources I might use. And then more importantly, here are the people that are going to help me reach this goal. These are the people that are going to help me achieve this, right? And I think that's really important, especially like in a pre-doc application, to say, like, why did you choose Yale? Why did you, who are you working with? What are the strengths of those people and how are they going to help you? And so there is a difference between a dissertation fellowship, right, proposal and a pre-doc. But the dissertation, and the dissertation is going to be much more, advanced, and you're going to have an abstract for the dissertation. You're going to have to like really be more developed. But I think that more than anything, the pre-doc is looking for promise. And one of the other things we're looking for, I think that one of our colleagues said to us, at least in history, and I'm sure that this goes for other disciplines also, is that we're looking for a person who's going to transform the field and transform and be transformative in the future, basically. So, and that's a lot to think about, but I think that, I think that's something to keep in mind, right? I think I might stop there if we.
Ernie, can I just ask
yes.
a general question before
yes, of course.
we get into the weeds, which the weeds really is where it's at, obviously. But you all did such a wonderful job in your very brief essay of breaking down the application process and what reviewers look for in the application. And you're bringing to that essay into this conversation experience both as applicants and as reviewers. And
the internet went out. Yeah.
I guess as just, at the
I'm
outset,
on my phone.
Miriam, I think you're on. You need to mute, Miriam.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. I guess I just wanted to raise at the outset, if you could just maybe just start us with the beginning of your essay, which I think could frame some of this, because you start with why apply, which I think is actually useful for everybody to think about briefly. The obvious answer is money and time, but there are other reasons as well why people apply, whether it's for the Ford or for other fellowships and grants opportunities. So, as we think about the specifics of the Ford and other specific grants and fellowship opportunities, would one or more of you just talk a little bit more about this question of why people apply and what are some of the motivations that people bring? And then maybe in turn, like how you read those motivations in the grant and fellowship applications as reviewers. Is that a reasonable place also to start?
Go ahead, Miras. I think Peter should.
But maybe useful also for people.
No, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Steve. I just wasn't, I know the one suggestion was for us to cover the article, so I wasn't quite sure what that looked at, but this is great. I think this is a good way. I will say there's a lot to be said even for this particular question. It's very painful. It's a good process. I think it's similar, I would say, for me to do a proposal for my project, similar as it would be if I was to submit an article somewhere. So one of the things I think is really important in this process is the intellectual growth, or the sort of figuring out what it is you're doing, right? So at the base level, like, what am I doing here? Where am I at in this project? And so it really allows you to think very thoughtfully, to take time, to think about what you're doing, all the different aspects. The first time you tackle a forward, it is daunting because there's like 4 or 5 different parts. If you're doing dissertation, there's even more parts to that. And so you need to give yourself a lot of time, as we say in that in the piece. But I think that in thinking through all these questions, writing it out, revising it, and more importantly, getting feedback on it. So that's why you need to build in that time. So getting feedback on what you're saying, looking at samples. That's one of the things I was going to mention. It's really important to look at samples, if not of this particular forward, but there's lots of samples from NEH, and especially NEH has a lot of, and they're very similar in terms of like what goes into a winning proposal, or at least articulating what is a strong project. So definitely, I think that this is so useful, even in the end, if you came away with nothing, right? Even like going on the job market, and certainly when you submit articles for journals, the feedback you get from me, and even with, because with the proposal, sometimes you get less feedback. I'll just have to say that not always is that feedback consistent at the time when you're submitted to the institution. Perhaps your peers will give you more feedback, but when you do submit to journals, I will say in every case, it's led to my book project because of the kind of intellectual ahas and suggestions and ideas, which you don't get when you're a grad student, right? It's gone. That's what I tell my students, when you get a PhD, that built-in review process or peer review is not there as much anymore. It's really hard to get people to read your stuff. So, milk it for all it's worth when you're in grad school. So certainly the proposal writing, I would say it's about intellectual growth. And as reviewers, it does get hard. I've been doing it for a number of years. It does get hard for me to I have to remember, put myself where I was at their position, right? Because they're so much more competitive today. And I don't want to scare anybody, but you all are probably highly competitive because where you are now. But when I read these applications, like Ernie was saying, with the pre-docs especially, these are people who are doing some phenomenal work. And that's why we see second and third year applicants who are applying for a pre-doc, they're called, why they're so strong, because they have a sense of what they want to do. So it's both writing and practice and writing and practice. So I'll stop there. I know my colleagues have a lot.
I just wanted to say that, just going back to what Steve had said also, is that, as we said in the article, right, I think that one of the things that's going on here is that you want to think of yourself as a scholar from the very beginning. And part of this is applying for grants and fellowships. So it's not necessarily just the forward, but all kinds of other things, right? And so one of the things that'll happen, and it's, as Mitos was saying, it's a daunting experience sometimes, right, to apply for things, right? Because they're asking you questions and there's all these things that you have to do. But I think in the long run, if anything, we should think of it as really the process. Yes, the product is important because you want to get the money, but I think you should think about the process and thinking about how the process is going to help you think about what you want to do eventually, right? Or at the moment, maybe you're applying for a grant to do some research for a particular project. It's going to help you think about how you're going to do that research, right? And what you're going to want to do with that. And also, it's going to help you kind of be in the game in some ways, right? And what I mean by that is not so much, it's all a game, as much as what we should think about is, how do you become part of a community of scholars? How do you speak to people in your field and other fields, right? And I think that it's something really important to think of ourselves from the very beginning as that, right? To think of ourselves as being part of a larger community where we're doing that. So I think that that's one of the key reasons to do this, even if it's a frightening experience. And even though you may say, I don't know if I exactly know what I'm going to do, in the process of writing it, you're going to find out, right? And it may not be successful, but the next one is going to be successful.
Maybe I can jump in. I really like the way you phrased the question, Steve. And I do want to say, before we go any further, thank you so much for having us, for all of you for showing up, and Aaron and Matthew and Steve for putting this together. It's nice, if nothing else, for us to see one another. It's been too long, and that is, an important part of staying healthy and sane these days, as I'm sure you all know. So on this question of why apply, I think, Mitos and Ernie hit on a couple of really important points, and I just want to underscore a few things from my own perch. One is, I think Miros is absolutely right, that applying for a grant or a fellowship or even a conference, when you don't get it, can still be a really important advancement in your intellectual growth and thinking about the project. And so use these as opportunities to work through problems, to work through questions that you have about your own work. In ways that you might not otherwise if you're just cooped up at your computer, if you're just writing a seminar paper, if you're just sort of in tunnel vision, dissertation chapter, crank out mindset and world. Use the process of actually pitching something to the outside world in a way that forces you to really think about your work in different ways. And I think that, you know, that is important in and of itself. Another sort of layer or piece of this is that applying to these things forces you to be concise. It forces you to know what your project is. And even before you have an argument, like the nature of a proposal is to propose something that you're going to do in the future. But I think, you know, we'll all say, those of us that review Ford files or other dissertation or postdoc competitions, I think among the strongest applications are the ones that are able to articulate what they think, even at that point in the process, what the argument will be, or at least may be. So that is to say, you know, one very kind of concrete material thing is to have less I wills, less my research may do this, and more I argue, my research intervenes in A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And part of that is, I think, speaking authoritatively in a certain way that we're not always trained to do, especially before we actually do a project, that we get more authoritative in our language and our pitch when we get to the end. But part of what reviewers, I think, do look for is a kind of sense of confidence. And sometimes that can come across just in the language. But I think part of the lesson here is that, you know, for me, and when I apply to stuff, is that if I have to sit down and describe my project, my dissertation or current book project in 2 pages, that forces me to distill it into the pieces that are most important. I can't go on for 25 pages. And that skill of like being concise and distilling things is a skill that you can apply across very, you know, any number of different facets of our profession, right? That's the same skill that you need to do the so-called elevator pitch when you're on a job talk or you're at a conference and somebody says, tell me about your dissertation, as you're going from one meeting to another on a campus interview visit, right? You have to distill it. You have to be concise. You have to hit the high points. And I think the conference proposal process or the fellowship proposal process really forces you to get practice at that. And you only get better at that the more you do it. And I think that that is really one of the sort of unspoken virtues of applying to stuff out there in the world. The other thing I'd say sort of along these lines is that we have to put ourselves out there. It's just sort of the, you know, it's sort of built into being a professional academic, I think. You put yourself out there when you show up to class to teach your sections, you know, every Friday or whatever, or to give a lecture every Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And that can be disorienting, that can be uncomfortable, right? But we sort of have to get used to that. And one of the stories I tell of when, you know, I sort of saw this in a new light, at least for me, was when my first book, The Power of the Zoot, was done. And I had made the revisions, and this was back in the day before it was submitted electronically. So I actually had to print out a copy and put it in a box and mail it back to the editor at the press. I wrapped it up and got the postage on it, and it sat on the floor of my car for, I think, 4 days, because I was kind of afraid about putting it out there in the world in this new way. And we have to get comfortable with that. We have to put ourselves out there in front of our students, in front of our colleagues, in front of review boards, even when we don't know who they are. And I think that applying to stuff helps us do that, right? It helps you pitch your project and put it out there in the world. And some people are going to like it, some people won't. And, you know, we all get rejected and turned down from stuff we apply to. And I usually come back to something one of my mentors, George Lipsitz, told me a number of years ago. He said, and this is, you know, a guy who's written a dozen plus books, as you may know his work. he said something along the lines of, every time I put something out in the world, I see it out there living and bumping into in the universe with other stuff that other people have put out there. And I try to remember that when I submit an application, that I may not get it every time, but I'm putting it out there and I'm gaining something from putting it out there. There are skills through this process and experience that I can identify and hone and practice and begin to apply in other aspects of my professional life. So those are things that sort of popped up in the first part of this conversation. And I have more stuff to add too, but I've been talking a while, so I'll shut up for a minute.
Can I add one thing here? I think one of the things that I've learned, thank you, Lucius. I put him on also letters of recommendation because he is like fabulous at letters. He knows so much. Luis is fantastic. Thank you. One of the things that I learned in the pandemic, one of the positive, well, there's lots of positive things. One of the things I learned, I think, in the pandemic, particularly around teaching online and so forth, perhaps you all know this already from a long time ago, but I learned this idea about how we learn in community. And that seems like really a basic thing that maybe we all know, but that's what students are missing so much, right? Being in conversation with each other to discover new things. And I was thinking, like, maybe when I heard this, we learn in community, this is because I was taking an online teaching course, or how to teach more effectively online. And I thought, like, yeah, that is one of my biggest aha moments, right? When talking to people about my work or talking about whether it's life or whatever. I remember as an undergrad having these rap sessions, right? We probably called them something else, but you had all these discoveries or these, seeing the world in a new way. And I think this learning in community, that's what, putting our stuff out there is about, getting that feedback so that it's not, just, I don't know why it just sort of hit me. I thought, yeah, we're not just this lone scholar in this idea of being perched away in this tower or wherever. It doesn't work that way. So I think that's really important, why getting yourself out there, as scary as it is, because it is very daunting. Think like, oh, I'm going to be discovered, I'm an imposter. We have all these, I always think the dissertation stage or even writing these chapters is like, it's like the most difficult thing you will do, because it's like you in the mirror, right? All the demons that you had come back at you, like all your insecurities right there, right? So you have to process all that. Unfortunately, sometimes you can get to the writing. But also I think another, quickly I'll say that I've heard that it's very, very useful when I think about is the idea that writing is thinking, and maybe that's an obvious another one, but like for me, it takes, I don't know what I'm going to say until I say it, till I process it. Some people seem to already have an idea what they're going to argue, but I'm like, I don't know till I get to the end what I really want to say, because it takes me a while to process things. But so as you write, you think and you process and you come back and you revise. So that's why I think doing all this is, so maybe you might want to move on, Steve, I don't know.
If I can add, a couple of other thoughts, if that's okay. I think one of the things I thought about when I read your specific questions that were shared with us ahead of time, and I have, some comments on those, as I know Ernie and Miros do as well, but it also made me think of, sort of a slightly more general approach to fellowships and conference proposals that, again, I mean, you'll probably catch a drift on some of the ways I have these conversations. I like to sort of drill in on certain skill sets that we can apply in various contexts of what we do. And I think fellowships and conference proposals really sort of ask us to do things that we are asked to do in lots of other aspects of academic life. But it reminded me, when I was thinking about this last night after we shared some emails, it reminded me of the best piece of professional advice I've ever gotten. And it was in a meeting much like this, long before the pandemic. And this was back when I was a UC president's postdoc in 2001 or 2002. And Richard Yarbrough, who's a professor of Black literature and Black studies at UCLA, was leading a meeting like this with young scholars, of whom I was one. And he said something that went along the lines of, quote, "Take power over the narrative of your own career." And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. And it was sort of confusing. And as the years went on, I came to really believe that it meant tell people who you are, what you're doing, and why it's important. Because if you don't do those three things, if you don't tell people who you are, what you're doing, and why it's important, then they're going to do it for you. And more often than not, they're going to screw it up and they're going to get it wrong. And I think that matters in the context of fellowship proposals, and that matters in the context of conference proposals, but it also matters in the context of going up for tenure review, of applying for a job, of submitting a manuscript to a journal editor or to a university press book editor. And, I think any time that we can take control of our story and sort of learn the skills that sort of help us polish how to narrate our story to other people beyond our immediate circle is really important, and that we should think consciously about how we do that and use those opportunities, sort of explicitly to sort of build that toolkit. And I do think that, fellowship proposals are, especially when you're in graduate school or even as a junior faculty member, I think are among the most kind of available and immediate opportunities to do that. And we should see them as such, not just as opportunities to sort of maybe get some money and support and funding, which is great, but really see it as you're putting your work and your name out there in the world so that people will begin to craft a narrative and a story about who you are and what you do and why it matters. Because if you don't sort of take the reins on that big kind of career narrative project, then again, I think somebody else will, and they may get it wrong. And that may mean that your file takes a wrong turn in the NEH application or the Ford application process or whatever a fellowship you're applying to, or it may mean that you don't make the short list at a job or such, right? But there are things that you can do in the context of an application to really, connect the dots for people. And I would say that this is one, sort of, that's kind of big in general. And there are other sort of, more specific, I think pieces of advice we can all give to fellowship applications, depending on the nature of the fellowship application and how many essays you have to write and, how many pages you have to play with and all that sort of thing. But one thing I would say is that the best applications I read are often the ones that make an argument across the different pieces of the application. So let's say you have a personal statement and a proposal and an abstract and a CV, just for instance, and there's different combinations of those and other things, or a previous research experience or whatever the case may be. The applications that I find most compelling, the ones that speak to me, are the ones that sort of really, I'm an historian after all, the ones that craft a story about how this particular applicant came to the place where this particular project sort of opened up a world of possibilities when it comes to the kind of impact that this project and scholar may make in the future with support from this particular funding agency. So making sure that you can kind of connect the dots, right, between your previous experience or just even your CV. Like, don't say on your proposal that you're going to do this really complicated methodology if you don't have experience on your CV that sort of indicates that, you have at least a start in that direction, or that you don't know that one of your letter writers might actually speak to you being adept at oral history in a way that you may not have as much room to speak to in your proposal, when that is sort of what you're hinging your application on. So the extent that you are able to sort of weave an argument that, again, who you are, what you do, and why it matters to sort of the larger world, I think you can sort of, to some degree, you can make that case in sort of connecting, almost like it's pieces of a puzzle, right? That this piece of my application fits with this piece. I really, the methodological piece fits here. The theoretical or historiographical piece fits here, and it comes together. So on their own, they may not sort of suggest, they might not make the case as strongly as possible, but together they see the portrait or a landscape of the bigger picture. And I think you, as the author of your applications, should sort of see how those pieces fit together. And when I can see it as a reviewer, then I think this is a great application. And I'll nudge, if I'm on a panel with Mitos and Ernie back in the day pre-COVID, I say, you got to read this one, because this is just beautifully put together, because those dots are connected and the pieces are there. And it gives us kind of more than the sum of the parts, if you catch my drift. But I think it begins with all of you as the authors of these applicants sort of seeing how that works from your position.
Can I ask a question kind of following up on that, Luis, to any of the three of you? And this comes actually from one of the students who's here, who wanted actually some suggestions or guidance regarding how an applicant can best leverage their recommenders. In other words, that's the piece of the application that folks can't usually see, right? But those recommendations that come alongside the application are oftentimes critical for making and breaking successful applications. So, this is in part asking you as applicants, it's as a part asking you as reviewers of fellowships, but it may also be about asking you as supporters of students who are applying to things. How can a student applicant best work with a recommender to assure that that recommender's words on their behalf is actually going to do the best work for the applicant in that particular application? Mitos.
Yeah, since I unmuted, I just wanted to say, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues right now, that's our next article forthcoming, which we've tabled. I had actually written something and then submitted it, and they kind of rejected it. So then I thought, why don't I get my fabulous co-authors here to do something? And Luis just beautifully, and Ernie came up with some beautiful things, but there's a lot of how-tos, write letters of recommendation. And it was good to do that learning, but I'll turn it over to Luis, and I'll just say, the only sort of general tip I would say for letters of recommendation, and I tell my students, is give me as much information as you can about yourself. The more specific I can be about you and say specific things, the stronger my letter. If I didn't have you in the class, there's some no's, you have to just tell, like, recommended. No, I can't take that because I don't even know you, but the more information, again, you can give, detailed, you might even, note instances how we know each other. There's a checklist, I think it's a professor from Stanford who has a checklist of 12 things that they expect from students who are gonna ask for letters of rec. And one of them is, remind me how we met, remind me in what context I know you, so that the person can, because sometimes we have so many students coming through, and it would just be helpful to have that. So there is, some professors do require certain number of things that you give to them, a little, file and so forth. But there are very specific ways. I think that I'll turn it over to Ernie or Luis to say more, but that's what I do.
What I would just say, I would just build on that, and then I'm going to defer to Luis. I would just build on that and say that what you want to do as a student to foster, when you want to foster those letters of recommendation, and you want to foster a relationship with your recommenders. So think about anything. Think about how you would think about your friends, right? If you were recommending one of your friends for something to somebody else, well, you would recommend them because you knew certain things about them, right? And so in this particular instance, right, you want that recommender, your professor, and then it's not always a professor, right? It may be somebody who hasn't taught you but has been an administrator for a program or something. You want them to know you in some way, right? You want them to know who you are. That doesn't mean that you have to divulge everything to them, right? They're not your therapist or anything like that, right? But you want to build a rapport with them so that what's going on is that they know you and they know who you are and they know what your work is. And, and that takes time, right? And I think that these days, and it may not happen at where you're at, but, I find that these days, less people come to see me, right? Because they do everything through email, right? And right now, of course, we're not seeing anybody, right? Because of what's going on. But, I find that the students that come and see me, I get to know them, and it's so easy to write them a letter of recommendation once I know them, right? And once again, it's about fostering that relationship with a professor, I think is really, really important, right? And it can come in different ways. I'll let Luis say something.
I'll start by just co-signing everything that Mitos and Ernie just said. And I remember the conversation that I had with the three of them via email last year. And in all honesty, I think part of I was in a different place last year. I was on sabbatical. My family and I were living in Barcelona and Catalonia. And, I was writing, but I wasn't dealing with other kind of day-to-day professional life. And so I think I had a relative clarity that I may not have now. So I don't know exactly what I said back then. It was the the Barcelonan life that gave me a sense of how to think about writing letters in a different way. But I will say that a couple of weeks ago, we were all on the Ford, and this comes up on the Ford, but also on virtually every other fellowship competition, where I think it was actually written in the question that you shared with us, Aaron, where and this came up at least I want to say probably half a dozen times on the interdisciplinary panel a couple of weeks ago for the Ford, but the comment from one reviewer or another was, I'm not sure about this file because the letters articulate the project much more clearly and forcefully and strongly than the actual proposal or the applicant does. And, on the one hand, I think this is sort of not unusual, right? And isn't inherently a problem, if only because the letter writers are more experienced, right? They have more practice doing all the stuff that, an application requires, describing a project, identifying its main arguments, highlighting its contributions and interventions, all that stuff. And so it makes sense that letters would do that differently and in some ways more effectively. On the other hand, you don't want letter writers to get your project wrong, right? You don't want them to sort of do their thing and dissect your project and then present it in the letter of recommendation in a way that doesn't sort of complement what you're pitching in your actual application. So I think some of the things that Miros and Ernie have already identified go a long way toward mediating that and maximizing not just who your letter writers are, but what they will actually say in the letter. So this begins, from, just sort of general principle of making life easy on your letter writers, at least as easy as possible. Give them plenty of time to read your stuff, give them plenty of time to write the letter, give them clean and clear deadlines. I always ask students, especially those that I write multiple letters for, which is a lot, to keep it all in one place, in one document with deadlines, and whether if it's interfolio or, if I ask them, do you want me to write a tailored letter to this, place or that place, then let me know, flag it. And if they don't ask you, then you should ask them, right? And you should, I think, do that for them, is just keep it all organized and clean. And I think Ernie is really right that the groundwork for a good letter is something that stems from a relationship that begins long before you actually ask for the letter. So this is, I think, connected back to take power over the narrative of your own career. When you're in a seminar with somebody, when you're riding the elevator or walking across the quad with somebody in between classes, or you see them at a coffee shop, a professor, and they ask you how it's going, use that as an opportunity to say, hey, it's going fine. You don't have to lay it all out there in a half an hour, mock job talk at the coffee shop. But I think you can sort of give them an update and use those informal moments as ways to, let them know that your project is developing. And all of those little things, right? That's relationship building, and that adds up. And then, 2 years down the line, when you walk into their office or Zoom into their office hours these days to ask for a letter of recommendation, it's not like somebody has sort of stepped out of the blue and they need you now because they're applying for something, but it's sort of the logical, organic outgrowth of this budding relationship that you've had with them for a number of years. So I think, just keeping in mind that everything you're doing now with your faculty, mentors, and advisors is really laying the groundwork, not only for them, by the way, to write letters for you for fellowships at the tail end of your, or in the middle of your graduate career, but also when you begin applying for jobs, and also for postdocs that you may apply for either as a graduating PhD student and as a junior assistant professor, because by that point, you may or may not have a long list of letter writers from beyond your graduate institution to write for you. So one thing I do, even these days, right, is I keep a list, not just in my head, but I actually keep a list, in a file of people that I can ask for letters. And if I haven't talked to them in a while, right, I'll drop them a note just to say, hey, how's it going? It's been a while since we chatted, right? So that if I ever, ask, if I apply for a fellowship next year, I'm not necessarily asking out of the blue. And especially these days when we don't see each other in person as much as we used to, I think, dropping a note, staying in touch, asking for a Zoom conversation is important, because it will basically just build that relationship. And you can't control what the letter writers write in their letters, but you can control to a certain extent the conditions in which they write letters about you and your work. And so doing everything that, Mitos and Ernie suggested, and really thinking about it in this much broader context of a relationship, I think is one that will ultimately lead to you getting better letters or good letters, because, you could have the best project in the world, but if you don't have the relationship with the letter writer, the letter probably is not going to reflect the brilliance of your project. And that's going to hurt you in the review process. So just a few general thoughts.
I just want to say that the one thing that struck with me that when we talked about letter writing, when we had that conversation, Luis, and it was that you said that you think of the letter as a kind of argument. From the very beginning, you should make an argument as to why this person should get this award, right? And it should have the letter should have like a thesis statement. It's something that I really thought about from then on. And I think that may help all of you think about, right? Like, how do you ensure that your recommender can justify, right, why you should get the whatever it is, right? And talk about you in a certain way, right? How do you get to that point? And once again, it's building that relationship and giving them all the information also that they need with the deadlines and everything else to write the letter. And I'll stop there, but I'll just say, the last thing I'll say is that even today, when I have to ask somebody for a letter, as Luis was saying, that he keeps a list, whenever I have to ask, let's say, Vicky Reese for a letter, I hesitate in like writing her because I know she's so busy. And I get all whatever worked up about it. And I send her an email, and then like within a half hour, 10 minutes sometimes, she says, of course, thank you. Don't worry. So, we all still have that, I think.
Just one quick comment, and I know we're going to open it up, Steve, but just what Ernie said, if I'm writing a letter and I want to have a thesis and an argument about why the student or colleague should get whatever they're applying for, it helps me when they tell me why they think they should get it. Not just that they have the proposal, but that part of their material packet that they send to me says, this is why I think I should get this award. And then I can use that as a starting point. That's part of taking the narrative of your own career, I think.
Also, I know we're moving on, but one of the reasons why we had thought about doing this, or at least I had thought, my initial idea was to write an essay about how to write strong letters of recommendations, because a lot of in my work that I was doing with diversity in the graduate division is that we weren't getting a lot of students from the Cal States, for the public institutions and teaching ones, because a lot of or they weren't making it through the rounds because a lot of the professors there did not really have all the skills they had to write letters of recommendation. So it's a way for us to do our own mentoring of our colleagues, I thought, at least for these letters of rec. And maybe, I know we're going to ask questions, but one thing that hasn't been discussed and I didn't see in the questions, but I think it's kind of like threading all their discussion today, is how is it, at least for myself as a woman of color, first gen, working class, well, not working class anymore, but coming from working class, immigrant, how do we navigate these spaces, and how do we put ourselves out there when we're feeling that perhaps, we are not entitled to, or the imposter syndrome I had suggested, because all the things we're asking you to do is to really put yourselves out there. And that is a difficult, I just want to acknowledge that it's not easy to do that. Some of us may feel much more confident than others. Some of us, and then I know the game in grad school, right? And it even happens, it continues, like, oh, so-and-so sounds so, so smart. I'm not as smart, or they really know they really got their act together, right? All these are like, sometimes games, sometimes not games, but I think in the end, you just need to be true to who you are. And then also you need to, for me, it's always about show me, don't tell me, right? If you're just sort of, and everything we're saying about putting these applications together, you need to have something underneath it to support what you're saying. You can't just say I'm all these great things, and then you really don't. This narrative that Luis said his mentor, somebody asked him to taking power over this narrative. Well, that narrative better be backed up with right? And so that's what we look for. That's what I look for. Like, where's the substance? Show me the substance.
I do want to ask everybody on this call to think of a question if they haven't already. And in a second, I want somebody else to ask a question. But let me just, perhaps this might be a question or might be a slight restatement of a piece of what I heard you all saying, which is you need your recommenders to be invested in your project and to understand your project and to understand your eligibility, a strong eligibility. And one of the things that I really admired in the essay that you wrote was how you underscored the importance of getting feedback from your mentors about the proposal in advance of actually submitting that proposal to wherever you're submitting your fellowship or grant proposal. And I'll just comment that, from my perspective, this is one place where I feel like a lot of the students I've worked over the years get a little bit tripped up, is that that's a moment where they're reluctant to actually share early with their recommenders. And so I end up getting, a final version of their application, whatever the deadline is that I've given them a week in advance of when I need to send my letter in, or 2 weeks. And so as a recommender, I'm not really part of the process. My input into the project is not being asked, or how the project is being described is not being sought. So I wonder if that's been the experience of any of the three of you, and if one of the one perhaps trick for some people is actually to keep in mind the ways in which a mentor or more than one mentor also might write a better letter of recommendation if they feel engaged as the application is being put together. I felt like that was actually one of the things that you were saying in your essay, which is why I wanted to highlight it here.
Definitely. I think it depends on what the student is and your relationship to them. If you're their primary PhD advisor, that's one thing, right? You need to have that relationship, I think, that you're suggesting. But if you're another committee member, perhaps you might let somebody else take care of that. It depends on the needs of the student. If they ask you for it, I found now I need to sort of say, like, okay, I can only do so many, because I'm a editor, like line editor, and I do that. People know that. So, but I think the relationship, depending on the student, but yeah, it's very unnerving to have somebody, here's what I'm doing, and write me a letter, and you're like, what? You're like, where were you the last 6 months? Literally, I've had people do that, and that's just not cool. On my end, I don't know what your all experiences is.
I think that Steve, in some ways, is not some ways, but is absolutely right. That I think that you want to send a draft of, you don't want to. It's a process, right? Writing any kind of grant. And you want to think about, I have a student that I'm talking to later, former student who's now a professor, who would, at the very beginning of the semester, would chart out her whole semester, right? And come in and she would give me deadlines about things, right? I'm going to turn in this paper this day, whatever. Not everybody's like that. But I think that what's going on is, what I'm saying is that you want to think ahead. And I think that you want to, yourself as to how you can write something, how you can put something together. And so you want to share those drafts with somebody who's going to write, especially if it's like, your primary advisor, so that they're engaged in it, in the process, as Steve was saying, right? And I find that in that way, you're able to then, that person is able to massage that proposal, right? And able to say, you don't want to put this, you want to put that, right? But it's a process. So I would say, as we said at the very end, right, start early, right, when you're writing these, and engage your professor, right, and maybe go to one person who's going to help you, that main advisor that you have. So I think that's really important to do that, to engage. I think that's a really great way of thinking of it.
I would just add that beyond agreeing with your point, Steve, and what Mitos and Ernie have said, is that you can, I think, strategically invite different committee members while you're in graduate school into this process, right? That it doesn't have to be the same for everyone. And so different applications, can be moments for different people on your committee to invest, or different pieces of one application can be different ways for different people on your committee to invest, so that you're not feeling like you're constantly inundating everybody with everything.
It's great advice. All right, I think Bayan first, and then Kati.
Hi, thank you all for being here and for sharing.
Also, please introduce yourself.
Okay, for sure, yeah. Thank you all for being here and for providing all of your helpful insights. My name is Bayan, and I'm a second-year PhD in history, and I broadly focus on slavery and racial formations in 19th century Ottoman Egyptian Sudan. So I'm right in between the Middle East and Africa fields. And so I actually had a question based off of my experience applying to the Ford Foundation and to the predoctoral fellowship, and one of the feedback, or one of the comments that I received said that I should have contextualize my historiographical interventions beyond just Sudanese historiography, but I guess in the larger context of history in general. And I think that's one thing I found found as a particular problem in being in like a very niche field that is hard to sort of make legible to other fields outside of the region. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to grant writing, like how do you strike the balance of like being very specific to sort of explaining your historiographical intervention in your own field and like the relevancies of your project and the nuances of it, while also sort of pertaining to this larger question of like how is it sort of contributing to the field of history or X field in a broader sense. And yeah, that's it.
I think that was a question that we received ahead of time. And that's
it was for me, yeah.
Yeah, it's very good. I think it actually, it's much clearer now that you articulate it that way, because I realize it is a challenge. It's a real challenge in seeing those, especially because, yeah, you're always told, and it's true, to speak to a specialized audience, I mean, a broad audience, even when it's in history, right? Even though we're in the field, that we're all historians, it's still areas that perhaps we're not as familiar with. And so that the idea is striking, but we do try to specialize. So, sorry, I live over a flight path, below a flight path. We are like, even though I do Chicano Latino history, sometimes I'll do occasionally Latin American history or something like that, where I'm at least somewhat more tangentially in that field. But it is good to engage literature that is both specialized in your field, but also someone that's broader. Perhaps you can tap into those. There must be studies related to your field that you use that are not perhaps related to what you're doing, but methodologically can be an intervention for you, right? That maybe you're borrowing from a different field, from, I don't know, British or some other, you like the methodology that you're using, you can bring that in. Find ways to speak to other kinds of literature that perhaps that you are using in your work. I don't know if Luis or Ernie have other specific suggestions.
I would say that one of the things that you want to do is that you want to say what fundamentally is at hand, right? What's important about this project. So, we may not know the literature in a given subject, right? But we know, like you could say perhaps, like that this is why this is important, right? Because it is going to speak to this issue, right? And if you know other literature, right, that that other people have done, right? If obviously it's something that other people haven't done at all, or maybe in your field people have done similar things. But I think that you want to, I always tell people, like for an abstract, for instance, to say, so-and-so has done this and so-and-so has done that, but I'm doing this, right? So I think that, doing it broadly, because I think that you're right. People may not know your field particularly, but they may know what's the issue at hand, right? How does it help us understand a greater problem, right? That may be something that happens in other places.
Right. I think this idea of educating the reader, right? That becomes really, really important. And so many things come into mind, because I think sometimes we are more successful when we apply to things that are more kind of within our range. Maybe in Middle East studies, we just had in my department, we just hired somebody in Middle Egypt, actually really excited to bring her on. So maybe applying kind of within your area is useful. But if you're able to make those, right, educate the reviewer and what is you're doing is significant. And then if the proposal then makes it, because there's different stages usually, then other scholars in the room will say, oh yeah, that's true, they're doing this, if they're more specialized. If the person who happened to be reading it was perhaps not as well learned in your field, somebody else then can be, so we rely on our colleagues. I'll just say that. We rely on our colleagues to help us say oh yes, or oh no, that's argument has been made before, they're overstating or they're understating, whatever. So we do rely on that. So that's why I think sometimes being in an interdisciplinary panel, like on the Ford, which I've done, it's massive. I mean, there are people from theater and dance, right? There's all these fields are being in that interdisciplinary panel. So there's 7 times more applications than there are in history, but there's also 7 times more awards. So, it's all proportional, but this is with the Ford specifically. But those are the 2 pieces of things, say, maybe look for specific, in your area. And then also, like Ernie was saying, educate the reader.
And the other thing I would say is this is where your faculty comes in. This is where your advisor comes in and says, you might, and sharing that proposal with your advisor, which, you might have I'm sure you did, but like I think that this is where it comes in also, right? Because they're going to be able to like help you kind of put it in perspective and project it to kind of people in other fields, because they have probably been doing that also throughout their careers already.
I know we have other questions, but I do have a quick comment or two to share on this front, because it seems to me that part of the question or the challenge is this idea of, making your work matter to people that study other fields, and sort of striking the balance between your specific field and some larger world of scholarship. And I think, Miros, you're onto something in one of your previous comments, that we can do that in different ways. And that everything that Ernie and Miros have said, I think, is right. My brain also, sort of thinks about and addresses this question in a kind of more categorical way. And Miros, when you said earlier that you can do it methodologically, I think there are other ways you can do it too. So that is to say, if you're striking a balance between your specific field and a broader world of scholarship, you can connect those dots methodologically, you can connect them thematically, you can connect them theoretically or conceptually, and that when you read your application essay or your proposal, then borrow Ernie's advice and have somebody, even a peer who's in another field, who may not study the place and the time and the people that you studies other folks other times and other places, but they're going to look at it and say, oh, this conversation, this kind of thematic innovation is something that speaks to me. This methodological intervention or use speaks to me. This kind of conceptual tool or notion that you're using, this theory, speaks to me. And if you can sort of think about how you are reaching that wider world of scholarship from your specific place through these different threads, but think about it like consciously, then I think your file, your application, will be read by reviewers from other fields long after it's left your hand, in a way that they'll be able to connect those dots. Because if you don't connect them like in your own head first, then it's going to be harder for other people to do it. So I would like break it down like in these different ways.
Thank you. That's all very helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Kati.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing this information and guiding us through the most fundamental parts of applying to grants. My name is Kathy. I'm a second-year PhD student in American Studies at Yale. My work broadly focuses on kinship and placelessness as of now. And I've looked at Central American students in higher ed and the ways that they navigate this process and how their identity, geographical context kind of shape that process, but also undocumented queer parenting and the ways that they navigate homophobia and xenophobia within their own units. I think my primary question was if you have any specific advice for students that are undocumented or have DACA in terms of disclosing their status, or whether or not their work specifically focuses on undocumented status, how they should navigate that, or what your experience has been reading applications that kind of focus on that or don't focus on that, or where the applicant is undocumented?
I will say, just from, that's a good question, thank you. From my own gut response would be like, if those applications come through, it's because the agency has a lot, has sort of that as an accepted category, right? That, and I can't recall the forward of if the forward or the other.
Yes, you can.
Okay, and so I take that. I guess I would. I don't know how to say this. Not necessarily give it more special status or less special status. It's just part of the mix. I don't know. Again, I'm looking for what Luis so beautifully articulated about this narrative that's being crafted through all these different pieces, right? And how they shouldn't repeat each other, but they come together to speak to this larger whole. So that becomes important. But I think that, of course, not resting the entire, application around this particular identity, but how that identity informs and structures the project or the questions, or how it's going to impact, that becomes, I think, more important. So it comes down, I think, in similar ways in terms of how you use that, context, identity, information. I think that all plays a role. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good question, because I hadn't really, I guess I take it for granted. It's part of, it's like the other projects. I'm not sure. Luis is.
No, I think it's a really good question. I think it's a difficult one because we don't know always how that will be received on the reviewing end of the application process. So I think part of your responsibility as an applicant, whether it's in the context of your own identity or in the context of the folks that you're writing about, is to, basically do the best that you can. So, yeah, so in other words, there are some application competitions where that is going to be received in a way that is, we could probably tell you, I could tell you, like, people are going to appreciate that on a Ford panel. I can't tell you if people are going to appreciate that on, say, an NEH panel. Right, I don't know, right? And part of it depends on the makeup of the review panel, which changes from year to year. But I think that there are some fellowship competitions and agencies that are geared, at least politically, toward working with, and in some cases for, undocumented communities that others aren't. And that should figure into your process in terms of how much you decide to include or not include. But it's an important question, but a hard one, because even at a fellowship review panel that one might normally think would be empathetic, then that changes, and we're talking about professors usually who are human beings, and they have different ideas, and those conversations can sometimes be like, I'm gonna, Ernie or Miros can chime in on this too, but I think part of what is really interesting about this question that it opens up for me is that part of the process of what happens to your file after you submit it is like a black box. And I think it seems to me that part of the utility of conversations like this is kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit to see the crotchety old person, pulling the levers behind the fellowship review curtain. It's faculty, it's people, and we've all been in review sessions and discussions where it breaks down along the same lines that conversations break down in the rest of life, on our campuses, in our departments, or beyond. And so it's not unusual, right? I remember the first time that somebody told me, before, this is many, many years ago, before I first did the Ford, and I think the first time I did it was with Ernie and Miros. But people told me horror stories about how some of the conversations got down to like horse trading between different racialized communities in the review panel, right? And I never really experienced that in my own times as a reviewer, but I've never forgotten it, because it was an indicator to me that those conversations are fueled and pushed much like any other conversation we have in our professional life or beyond. And so that's why I say that it's sort of we don't know, but it's also you can do your due diligence to the extent that you can.
And what I would say is that Steve has put something in the chat, which I think he's absolutely right. So it depends on the funding source, right? Whether they're going to accept the application, right, or not, right? And the Ford especially does that, right? But I think that one should look at the fact that, who you are, like I always think of this when this is the way I kind of think of, like the projects that the students that I've worked with have done. And that is that most projects come from a place where somebody wants to understand themselves or a part of themselves. And so what happens is that, as we said earlier, right, that, it's part of taking control of that narrative, and then also making who you are part of the process of your scholarship, right? So I think that's, so I would say, once again, right, it depends on where you're applying. And I think that the Ford and other places, I'll just say it this way, and for lack of a better way of saying it, are safe spaces for this. And I think that you want to think about how your life experience has led you towards this place where you're working on this project at this given moment, and why you're doing that, right? So it goes so who you are goes hand in hand with the scholarship. and some people may not think that, right? But I always think that people who are able to tap into that are going to do much better. Everything's going to go better. Well, at least on your end, it's going to go better for you because you're going to be engaged with it, right? I think that's what happens in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully said. And, make the case that who you are equips you better than another applicant, to do the project that you're proposing. And so if you can connect the dots between who you are and make that case, then I think it's compelling and works in your favor.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Marius Kother, and I am a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of History. I study 20th century African history, focusing on themes of decolonization, gender, and nationalism. So my question is about generally I know that applying for fellowships is a great thing and you should try to keep up with different application seasons, but I'm wondering if there are certain points that in your own career that you've decided that certain fellowships or like certain fellowship seasons you're just not going to participate in and focus on other parts of your career. So I'm getting up to the point of writing. So I've been writing my dissertation, and I have a pretty strong application fellowship record, and I'm also looking for towards the fall semester where that would be the time where I'll be applying for dissertation fellowships. And I'm wondering how to think about how many different fellowships I should apply for, because in the previous application seasons, even though I was very successful in the process, it was very, very draining. And I'm just thinking about doing that in addition to writing the dissertation, in addition to trying to get like a publication, because I'm thinking of putting together the whole application, the whole like applying for job markets and making sure my CV has the different components, and publications are an important part of that. And so I'm wondering if you've made decisions at certain times of your career, like you're just not going to apply to a certain fellowship, or you're not going to participate in a fellowship season at all because of whatever reason, and how you recommend that graduate students, especially in the upper years, start thinking about the ways that you want to engage or not engage with different application seasons and different applications. Yeah, thank you. Oh, I also read your essay and I thought it was really great. And I really enjoyed it precisely because it talks explicitly about the relationship between the different components and why it's important to think about them together. So I wanted to thank you for sending that. I really appreciated it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the positive feedback, all of you, really. Well, first of all, Marius, I think you're being very smart in thinking about like, what can I physically, humanly, myself do, right? It's about, again, everybody's different. So it's important to think about how you work best, like the levels of stress and I'm not going to say work-life balance because it's really my view is a farce, but what you can do in terms of prioritizing, what do you need to do to move right, sort of in the long term, and you're looking at your dissertation, how that's going to be about the job market and that getting you where you want to be. It's about there's another aspect that you have like three main things going on: dissertation, job market. I think you said, was that the other
Publications.
Publication. I'm sorry. So taking the publication right from the dis. And then the proposals, the fellowship. That's a lot to take on, and sometimes people will then also have the job market, right? They're balancing four things potentially because they need all those different components to get them where they want to be. And when I was in grad school, I guess I didn't think I had a choice, to be honest, for me personally, because I was looking for something. I did because I had TA-ships, the first few years, and I had some funding. But it's smart to make a conscious choice, and I have throughout the years, but more so in my case, it's been because I felt like my project wasn't strong enough or wasn't there yet, or I hadn't done enough research. Like I applied, like right now I'm thinking about, I have a new project that I'm doing, but I haven't done enough research. And I put myself out there and I got rejected, and I thought, oh, that's probably because it's not where it needs to be. So I know that, but that is kind of different reasons for you. But I do think it is important to be strategic and thinking about what you want to prioritize and thinking about that next year. Can I make it, financially or whatever, if I don't apply this year? And if you can, and that's okay. If that's taken care of, I would say prioritize the dissertation and the publications. I tell my students, if you don't have a dissertation or a strong publication, you're going to get hired based on your publication record and based on your work, right? Which is all these things. Fine. So that's ultimately, in my view, why a committee will select your work over somebody, or select you as a candidate over, it's the work, right? The dissertation, the publications. And of course, the grants and fellowships speak to many of the things. But if you have other things in your belt and you really want to take more time on doing that, I don't, again, it depends on the person, but I don't think that would be a bad choice. I don't know, because it is draining, right? And sometimes for me, I can't do, you try to multitask and nothing is done well. So I'd rather focus my energies on certain things. I don't know, maybe you'll have Luis and Ernie here.
I would just say that, yourself best when it comes to the kind of work that you can do. And I think that also sometimes it's better to prioritize, finishing the dissertation, right? If you know that you have funding, right? Or working on an article because you know that it's going to go somewhere, right? So that you can, it just all depends on like where you are in the process, right? So I don't think that. One could say, oh well, like working on a proposal for a fellowship is going to help you, but if you know that it's just going to take away from everything, right? It's going to take away from the larger study, right? The dissertation, then, concentrate on that, right? Concentrate on what you think is the most important thing, or what's going to get you to the next step at this moment.
I can add a quick thought. I do remember taking time off to answer your question directly from a fellowship cycle during graduate school, but that was mainly motivated in part by the fact that I had, some security in funding for the foreseeable future. And so I made a judgment call that even if I applied for stuff that might have given me more money, it wasn't worth it time-wise, because I already had some support and I could, crank out a couple of chapters and then be more competitive for other stuff. And I think that's the thing that's important to remember, is that, finishing the dissertation, or even getting to the point where you have 2 chapters and an intro that you can circulate and sort of be more competitive on the job market as an ABD person, like getting to those different levels will open up new opportunities for you in ways that, applying for a bunch of stuff and then even getting something or not getting something for sure might not. The only other thing I'd say here is that, I think for me, what I found in making that decision about whether or not to apply for stuff or to skip cycles depended in part on the proposals that I already had in the bag and their success, which is to say that a successful proposal, you can live off one successful proposal for a couple of years and a number of cycles. And the work, if you can streamline it, it's still work and it's still labor and stress and all that. But it's wonderful when one proposal can fund you for multiple fellowships and cycles with a little bit of tweaking along the way. So if you can get to that point, right, then maybe that factors into your decision. I'm not going to apply to everything, but maybe strategically here or there, because I've already got this thing, more or less good to go, and I can submit it with less trouble.
Thank you.
Amanda.
Hello, my name is Amanda. I'm a first-year student in the American Studies department, and I'm interested in feminist activism and gender violence in Puerto Rico. So you guys, first of all, thank you just so much for coming and for doing this panel. It's been extraordinarily insightful, and I've been taking diligent notes because I think just the whole fellowship and grant process from afar can just seem so daunting, and it can just be very tricky to navigate. So thank you so much for this panel. Thank you so much for the article that you wrote, kind of helping break down, what that process looks like. I know you guys touched on this a bit earlier, and so I don't mean to sound redundant, but for those of us who struggle with imposter syndrome, who we're new to this process. Personally speaking, I'm also a first generation college student. Everything is very new. I'm just kind of learning about academia as I go. And so for those of us who kind of struggle with putting ourselves out there, asking the faculty member, like, would you be willing to, write this recommendation, or man, like, should I even consider applying to this fellowship? Because I don't know if, I'm quite there yet. Do you have any practical advice just for pushing through and just taking that risk? And sending that application or talking to that professor?
I guess the first thing I would say is, trust yourself and your instincts. I mean, you are where you are because you're good at what you do, and people think that you are good at what you do and that you have, a great deal of promise to continue to do great and wonderful things. So trust yourself and your instinct, and know, I think that a group like this and a gathering like this is an indication that you have a community where these sorts of questions are ones that are not only okay to ask, but okay to have discussions and talk about collectively. And the other thing in this, so that's kind of like the positive spin, it seems to me like, is to kind of have that mindset to these sorts of big questions that you're asking. I think I would, on the, it's not really the flip side or the underbelly, but kind of like the realism side of things. I think that those feelings and questions don't always go away. And I think that we all deal with them, no matter our seniority, for in a professional way for our lives. I remember a conversation I had with somebody at a conference many, many years ago when I was, I think, still a graduate student or maybe an assistant professor. And it was a senior professor who told me that they wake up with the sweats in the middle of the night, worried about a review that they're going through. And I just thought, what, this is, I didn't sign up for that, right? But it was really a lesson in that, those sorts of concerns and questions are sort of in some ways, unfortunately, not necessarily built in, but something that we constantly have to address. But I think that the actual recognition of that is part of the trick of learning to deal with it and navigate it in important ways. And then I know Miros and Ernie have things to say too, but I think it's endemic of our profession that we're asked to do things that nobody trains us how to do. And so part of being able to come to grips with that, which I think is different than, the fear of putting ourselves out there, is to lean on one another in spaces like this, but also without Steve and without Miros and Ernie and me and all of you thinking about collaborative, collective mentorship with one another and finding ways to train yourselves too, right? Across the span of the graduate experience. So the senior students help the intermediate students, and the intermediate students help the new students, the first years, and that you'll pay that back when somebody comes into the program next year. That these different models of mentorship are really important to theorize, because the academy relies too heavily on this kind of senior model, this model of senior scholar, junior scholar, and it's just the two of them, the apprentice model, right? There are other things we can do to kind of challenge the nature, the hyper individualism and competitiveness and kind of guild system mentality of the academy. And part of that sort of relies on our own ingenuity. It shouldn't be that way, but I think sometimes that just thinking about that can help. And then the last thing I would say is, Steve, Miros, and Ernie and I have, a colleague, David Gutierrez, who recently retired, and I think at different points of our own careers has been there for us collectively and individually. And he always used to tell me, he taught here at UCSD. I took classes with him as an undergrad. And he asked me when I was an undergraduate in his lower division Chicano history class. And then he asked me, like literally 2 weeks ago, he's retired now. He said, dude, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? And sort of thinking about, what that means in an academic context, for me, it's funny and it's kind of silly, but it also gets back to a lot of the things that we've talked about here today. And, I think it means, just kind of being okay with sometimes being a fish out of water and being uncomfortable, but also being, raising your hand and asking the questions and having those conversations with people.
I just want to say that I think that Luis is absolutely right about the notion of community. And that is, and community changes over time. And it's about like finding those people that are going to be able to sustain you in some ways, right? And I think that, and I think that we all feel that way of being, like it comes and goes, right? Of being, and I don't know, I don't call it imposter syndrome because that's a kind of newer term for me, but I think that, like these days I go like, oh, wait, I guess that's what it was, or that's what it is, because it keeps happening, right? But the way that I'm able to work that through, right, is to think about a larger community and to think about my contributions to that and the contributions of others to that community. And so I would, say that, and Luis is absolutely right about Dave and the wonderfulness of Dave. In fact, I was just thinking about him this morning. So that's great that you talked about him. Yay.
I'll just say one final thing. I'm going to share an article, if you don't mind, Steve. I'll send it to you. It's this article that I wrote about. I like to write articles about kind of mentorship on different aspects. It's called I should have renamed the title, but it's something about a senior professor advises junior professor students on junior scholars on the publishing, on how to publish a piece. And I talk about the process of what you need to do. And then at one point I talk about how it can be really difficult. And I talk about a personal experience that I had with trying to write my second book and what some of the challenges I faced. And I really got maybe too real, but I wrote really honestly. And I had some people email me and say oh my God, that was so powerful. I had a similar experience, and I just had feedback and I like doing that, validating other people's not horrible experiences, but their experiences within a certain range. I think that sometimes it can be debilitating if we go too much, and it's not all about that, right? But it is important to recognize and to affirm to other students. I had a former undergrad student, football player at UC Davis, African-American student who's now got his PhD, in education. He's from Oakland, and he's just doing these great things. And he asked me recently, a couple of years ago, on Facebook, he said, Dr. Mitos, do you still experience imposter syndrome? And I was like, no, what are you talking about? And I felt well, why did I nearly kill myself writing my third book? Why did I push myself so hard that I literally landed in the hospital, over different things because of stress, right? Internalized stress and all these things happening. I guess I do. This going back to this point, it just never goes away. It transforms itself. So, but checking yourself and making sure you're taking this idea of self-care. I was what is that? But I realized yesterday I took the day off, most of it off. I'm that's self-care. So little things. Thank you, everybody. Oh.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. That was a great question, Amanda, and really great. Really great responses and answers from the three of you. We're really winding down here. And I was trying to think of whether I have a great final question to pitch to the three of you to sort of wrap this up, but I can't quite come up with it. But maybe I'll just kind of open the floor for any of the three of you, Ernie, Mitos, or Luis, if you have any kind of final thoughts or comments for this group of wonderful graduate students who are working on important projects, obviously, who are, in the struggle, right? And all the different ways that people are right now, particularly under COVID conditions, thinking about things like fellowships and grants, and also conference applications, which came up a little bit less directly here in this, in this discussion. Anything that didn't come up that you think is worth underscoring, anything that's worth restating or reminding people of that kind of came up over the last half hour, it'd be great to hear from you if you have anything. So.
I'll say one thing that I like to, I think sometimes helps ease students, particularly around fellowships, which I can talk about. When we think about this idea, the biggest, for me, because personally it's been a stumbling block or been something that we need to go, is this question that's always asked, the so what question, right? Why does your work matter? What is the contribution? What is new and different? Because that's one of the things that's really important. And I think it's just to remember, to remind you as well that we're not always coming up with this huge intervention or doing something groundbreaking. Even if we're just adding a grain of sand, that's an important grain of sand, right? You're adding to, so don't put so much pressure I'm not, a new discovery. I'm not curing cancer here, right? It's okay. You don't have to cure cancer. We don't all cure cancer, but that, whatever you're doing, it is making a contribution, right? If you're not sure, ask people, talk to people, what has been done, what hasn't been done. And not just because it hasn't been done, should I do it? Well, why, right? Why is that going to be? What is it going to tell us that we don't really know and that we should know about? So don't right, because all of you are here because you're probably your worst critic. You pushed yourself so hard to be here. And so just, think about that. So that's what I tell students, like, okay, this is what I'm doing.
I would just add to that and say, I think that most of your work is something that has never been thought of before, and you should. And we know so little about the world usually, right? And I think that like you're all going to do great work that is going to really be transformative. I really believe that, and I think that we need more people doing work that is dealing with underrepresented groups and communities and events and places and spaces and all these different things. There's so little of us really in the long run. So if anything, like that, I hope that kind of like inspires you in some way, that like you're going to do something that nobody has ever done before.
I just have one thought or two, but Ernie, your comments and Miros, yours too, sort of reminded me of a time when I was in graduate school. I was finishing my dissertation, and my first book was on Zoot Suiters during World War II. And I remember when my dissertation advisor, I walked into his office, David Montejano at University of Texas at Austin, and he slid a stack of papers. It was a manuscript across his desk to me and said, "You have to read this." And it was Eduardo Bagan's book, who we all know, and he had just the book had yet to be published, but it was being reviewed. And it was also on zoo suits during World War II. And I thought, oh my goodness, and I just sort of had this really moment of crisis about that what I had to offer in my particular topic and field was being done by somebody else, and that I was totally screwed in the last 6 years in graduate school were, all for naught. And, I came to realize that even if we were writing about exactly the same thing, which we weren't, even if we were dealing with exactly the same sources, which we weren't, that I had something unique to say, and I had a different spin on things than this other person and this other scholar. And that was a really instructive lesson for me, because it reminded me, or really forced me to sort of come to grips with this idea that I did have something to offer, even when I think I didn't. The other thing I'd say is, just to underscore this idea of leaning on one another. And I think that can help us all sort of navigate, the fellowship process and the conference proposal process and everything else that we're asked to do that nobody else tells us how to do. That if we can lean on one another, not just across rank from senior professor to beginning graduate student, but also, within the graduate student community and across sort of in a horizontal ways, you all can help one another. And it helps sometimes to formalize those things, right? I mean, you don't have to like make it super, super formal, but those moments when I was a graduate student, when we said, okay, we're going to meet every Sunday and we're going to read somebody else's work, and then we're going to talk about it. There were no professors in the room, and we were, having those conversations over beers and potlucks with people. But those moments, just setting aside a time and a place to do those things, I think are what got me personally to the place where I could be more effective at everything that I was doing. And so lean on one another, but don't be afraid to, really kind of carve out the time and space to do that, and not just let it happen, kind of haphazardly or organically. But thank you so much. This has been awesome and fun.
Thank you. Aaron.
I don't want to foreclose any further conversation here, but I do want to, I'm aware of the time, and I do want to thank each of the professors for coming and talking to us and for letting us share this reading so that we could all learn about, a really critical skill in the process of academic development. And I want to thank everybody else for coming to this session, for giving us some questions beforehand, and for learning with us and, having us all be together. So I'll pass it back to Steve.
Yeah, thank you all. I just put my favorite line from your article in the chat, where you say, "We can attest that after many hours of reading proposals, many of which are unclear and uninspiring, we're left bleary-eyed, bored, and starved from some excitement." So it's just a way of saying thank you for not leaving us bleary-eyed and bored. And I think that what you've done to as you said, to kind of lift the curtain a little bit and let us see behind the review process and give us some ways of thinking more clearly about applications from your standpoint, again, as reviewers, but also as applicants yourself, and as supporters of other applicants has been just terrific. And, I particularly appreciate, your willingness to sort of be vulnerable here and talk about your own, your own feelings about the profession, your own sense of what's hard about doing this as an applicant and as a reviewer. And I think that's something that all of us will take away from this. So, we couldn't have had, I think, a better group of people to talk to us about all of this. And, I think many of us will now be kind of circulating, not just some of the comments you made today live, but also the, the article itself. And so I think it's great to think that it's going to have, a more expansive life, following on this discussion. So thank you so much, Ernie and Miros and Luis, for being here with us. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. It's been really nice to see people. Please do stay well. During these times, it's been a stressful time on the Yale campus for reasons that we know locally, but it's a stressful time out there in the world. And so the chance to come together and to have these kind of frank conversations that, really are also very practical conversations, I think is a really wonderful thing to do, even on a Friday afternoon at 4:30. So I appreciate everybody's persistence in sticking with this. So with that, I think we'll let folks go. And, at the end of their article, Ernie and Miros and Luis invite readers to be in touch with them, a bold move by any author. So you should take them at their word. And I'm sure if you have a follow-up question you'd like to ask them, that they'd be happy to respond to you via email. So with that, let me thank everybody.
And stay tuned for our next article, right, guys?
Yeah.